chapter.
Got it.
And tonight we are lucky to have Andrea Williams, who is the Director of Biodiversity Initiatives for the California Native Plant Society in the Sacramento. She works out of the Sacramento office. And just before we get going, I am Ellen Dean. I'm the secretary of the chapter. And we are still looking for a treasurer. We may have one person who is interested, but they're interested in sharing the position a little bit with somebody. So if any of you are good with numbers and spreadsheets, or have a financial advisor who loves plants, please get in touch with us. And our information and contact information, I think, is on our website. So our website has information about our field trips and these programs. And we also have an email address that I check, the Channel Islands email address. So let us know if you have any questions for us. Okay, so we'll go ahead and I'll introduce Andrea. So Andrea has 2 decades of experience in science-based public lands management, monitoring rare plants and plant communities, carrying out project compliance surveys, mapping and removing invasive plants, and responding to landscape level threats such as Phytophthora, climate change, and altered disturbance regimes. She's worked in partnership to design indicators, metrics, status, and trends for land health, lead volunteers in botanical inventories, improve the quality and quantity of data submitted to the California Natural Diversity Database, and teaches plant identification, field methods, and invasive plant management planning. So we're very lucky to have her working for the California Native Plant Society. And this evening, her talk title is California OakWatch, Tracking Oak Regeneration in the California Floristic Province. So Andrea, you can take it away.
Thanks,
and
Ellen.
everybody, if you could mute yourselves if you're not already muted.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. And I'm super happy to be here tonight because I love talking about plant identification, even when it is for a group as tricky as oaks, or messy, as I call them. So California OakWatch is about understanding where oaks are reproducing or not reproducing in the California Floristic Province. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is kind of why oaks. So give a little background on oaks, talk briefly about some of the key features and what you might want to look for when you are recording information to identify plants, and then talking a little bit about plant identification in general, how to meet a new plant, understanding the relationship between different species, noticing the little things, and setting yourself up to get good help, either from people or from computers or from both. We'll talk a little bit about putting it all together, going with the preponderance of evidence when picking a species or a variety, and then the OakWatch project and how to dig deeper and contribute your knowledge to a greater, or contribute to your information to a greater body of knowledge. So taking a step back and looking at the family that the oaks are in, they're in the Fagaceae, which is usually called the beech family. We have 3 genera of these nuts in California. Oaks or Quercus are by far the most speciose genus. It's pretty different from others in this family in what is a really understated involucre if you look at the rest of the representatives. And the involucre is what we call the cap of the acorn in the oaks, but it's really what surrounds what you would consider to be the nut itself. And so if you look at something like the chinkapins, our chrysolepis were split from the other chinkapins, which are eastern and Asian species, Castanopsis. They do really resemble chestnuts more in their burr-like involucre, but in their leaves look kind of a lot like golden oaks. They have kind of this this beautiful golden underside to their leathery leaves. So 3 taxa, which include species and varieties. So 2 species, one of which has a couple of varieties, and then tan oak is the other genus in California. They were part of Lithocarpus, but were split from those stone oaks to become Notholithocarpus. And we have 1 species in California that has 2 varieties. They very loosely resemble kind of an island oak or a saddler oak, and they're really large leaves with kind of these indented leaf veins. But they have this curly capped acorn that you can kind of see in the acorn itself is very fuzzy. This species is really being hit hard by sudden oak death, particularly up where I am in the Bay Area. And then there are the not in California genera. So species or genera like chestnuts or castanea, the beech trees, sphagus, stone oaks, chinkapins. So you can think about this family as being really recognizable for its really useful nuts. So a staple of the diet of a lot of animals in the world, and really important. So sticking with our rule of 3, we have the Quercus of California. There are 3 groups of oak that are recommended, that are represented in our state. One of which are the red oaks or the black oaks. We tend to call them black in California. So they are represented throughout by this little red and black heart. They're section lobati, tend to have scaly acorn caps, those scales resembling like snake scales or bird feathers. You can see it in this picture of coast live oak. The acorn caps themselves tend to be hairy inside, and the bark is usually darker than in white oaks. And we'll get to meet a lot of these red oaks a little later. The white oaks or blue oaks in California, section Quercus. The oaks have these tubercled acorn caps, so they appear pebbled, and you can see that really well in this photo of the leather oak. The caps are not hairy inside, and the bark tends to be pale gray to whitish. And then the gold oaks are considered to be intermediate oaks. So they tend to have shallow capped acorns. The caps themselves are fuzzy inside and very often outside as well. They're kind of small tubercled or thick scaled, and so intermediate between the thin scales of the red oaks and the pebbled look of the white oaks. The leaf undersides, the young twigs, and the caps themselves are often golden. And they're represented by the gold star. So third rule of botany is when in doubt, call it a hybrid. And oaks are very messy. They're variable within the taxa, and they'll also hybridize within their group, even between evergreen oaks and which are called live oaks, and deciduous oaks. So when I first learned that, it kind of, I don't know, blew the cap off my whole concept. It was kind of like the prairie chickens who hybridize and they don't know how to dance anymore. It's like, well, do you drop your leaves? Do you not drop your leaves? So oaks really have kind of redefined, I think, a lot of people's conceptions about what is a species really. And I guess that's what happens when you kind of throw your pollen to the wind like that. But we do love them. They're pretty various in California. There are 30 plus kinds of oaks. And so that does include 13 named hybrids. There are around 20 species, depending on what you consider to be a species if you lump or split. 5 of those species make up 11 varieties. And then 12 of the kinds of oaks are rare in California. They do support tremendous diversity of insects, which support birds. The acorns and the trees themselves support mammals and lichens, and they're really foundational to the systems that they grow in. If you think about the oak woodlands and savannas, if you think about a lot of the coastal scrub and chaparral communities, those oaks are really fundamental to supporting tremendous diversity of life. And many of our native oaks are not regenerating as we might expect or as we might hope. And we're losing a lot of mature species or mature trees and shrubs to development, to pests, to pathogens. So thinking about sudden oak death, thinking about gold-spotted oak borer, and to climate change as well. So it's very difficult, particularly with our hot, dry, and extended drought periods for those young oaks when they sprout from an oak to a seedling, when they grow from a seedling to a sapling. and they try to make that transition to a mature tree, they don't really have the resources to weather a drought, a multi-year drought, the way that some of the more mature trees do. So the part of the point of this OakWatch project is to help track regeneration so that we can understand where it's happening and make sure that those areas are protected. So thinking about coast live oak and going back to, wanting to understand the oaks or a particular genus or group of plants through the most common species, this is by far our most common oak in much of California. It's really kind of the flagship red oak. It will readily hybridize with others in the group. I'm going to say this a lot tonight. A lot of people will point to kind of these cupped leaves or the hairy pits. And let me go to the laser pointer so that I can point that out for you. So if you see here in these axils between this mid vein and the lateral veins, these little tufts of hairs, that's something that coast live oak is known for. Doesn't always have it, isn't always cupped, but something that is pretty reliable are these, how many pairs of veins, lateral veins that this taxon will have. So 1, 2, 3, 4.5. So usually 5 or fewer lateral pairs. Oaks are super variable. So the age of the tree or shrub, the age of the leaves, the age of the twigs will all change appearance, as will stress from herbivory or fire or other environmental cues. Even without hybridization, it can be difficult to identify them. So not that I'm trying to set you up for failure, I'm just trying to, I guess, set the stage for letting you know that this is not something that is easy to do. And so we're gonna help each other through it. So learning the common species, a lot of our common oaks do represent the major breakpoints in the key, which follow those groups that I talked about, the red, the gold, and the white oaks. So if you think about the red oaks, the coast live oak, very common, the white oaks, thinking about valley oak being very common, and then the gold oaks, canyon live oak being fairly common as well. And then learning the features that you'll need to tell the common plants from the others. So understanding how the plants will vary in their habits. So are they trees? Are they shrubs? Are they low growing? Are they multi-branching? The habitat that they grow in, do they grow on serpentine soils? Do they grow on granitic soils? Do they like sandy soils? Is it a woodland situation? Is it a forest? Is it chaparral? And then the growth form in particular can be important for oaks. Thinking about the acorns, the bark, the twig and leaf characteristics, which we'll go over, some of the leaf veins, leaf features, the veins, the trichomes, which are a particular name for the kinds of hairs, and then the upper and lower surfaces. And then taking pictures and uploading your observations is a great way to get help with having other people participate in identifying your observations and giving you some tips. So CalFlora is a wonderful resource for doing a little more intensive mapping of a lot of these species. So you can put in a lot more data. You can track particular plants over time. You can create polygons. We're not going to be talking about CalFlora much more today because our project is an iNaturalist, because our work goes up into Oregon and down into Baja and does follow the California Floristic Province. So CalFlora is limited to California in that way. Giving a sense of scale is great in a photo. So it could be your hand, it could be a ruler, it could be coinage, if anybody carries cash money anymore. It used to be a lens cap, but nobody's got lens caps, so that's not a thing. And then note things that aren't capturable in photos. So if there are aspects of the soil type or something that you noted that you can't quite get your camera to focus on, great to have notes about that. And then I always say be lazy but suspicious. So iNaturalist will suggest from your photo a match to either a genus or a species, and I will often take that match and go check the description in the key, or have that as a starting point in the key itself, and that's the suspicion. So am I seeing in the key something that describes what I saw in the field from that starting point? And then sketching is an excellent alternative, but less shareable. When I first started with plant identification back in the last century, sketching was much more available because, I don't know, I think it was before digital cameras, certainly before I had a digital camera. And there's nothing really that gets you to look at the details better than actually drawing something. So if you keep a field notebook, it's an excellent way to kind of embellish that and get you to really see and remember and understand the things that you're actually looking at, and great to refer to later. So talking about leaves a little more, the surfaces of the leaf. So surfaces, very important. Hairs, where and how much it's hairy. This will vary in age between plants and between plants. So young leaves may be hairy in a different way than older leaves. So looking at the leaf axils here in coast live oak, that's fairly variable. It's diagnostic if it's there, but it's not always there. So if you have it, that's great. And if you don't have it, you need to look for other characteristics. Looking at island oak, you can see maybe some of the hairiness here. And then definitely in this Nuttall scrub oak, if you look really closely at the hairs, they're stellate. So they come up and then they branch out in this kind of star pattern. So that's really important to identify that species. And then looking at the hairiness of the San Gabriel oak, how fuzzy it is. So the curliness, how oppressed or upright the hairs are, all really important. So it's great to get really close in to those species. And then the veining, also very important for these two species. I talked about the lateral veins and then the veins being indented. That's something that's really important with this island oak, as you can see kind of the ridging on the underside and the indents on the top side of the leaf. Edges of the leaf. So spines and teeth, usually really variable, particularly in something like canyon live oak. So you can see in this photo how variable it is even on a single twig. So the leaves at the bottom are super toothy, and then up at the top, the margins are entire. And that's understanding that this species just does that. Blue oak, similarly variable in how toothy it is. Sometimes it will be not toothed at all, and sometimes it will be fairly toothy. And then Tucker's oak, you can see slightly variable kind of within a certain number of teeth. So this leaf here, no teeth at all. This one has 3. This one has kind of 1.5. This one has 4. It will be variable within, 0 to 4 or 0 to 6. And that will be represented in the description of the species. And then thinking about the leaf margins here on the San Gabriel oak, those enrolled margins, and then again, the surface underneath. So even though these are super variable in the number of teeth that they have, the overall shape will be stable. So it's overall, broader kind of at the center, rounded at the tip, narrowed at the base. This one's teardrop shaped, regardless of how toothy it is. Similarly with this Tucker's oak kind of obovate. Bark, twigs, and petioles. The bark can vary somewhat in furrowing. This is something that if you get into oak identification, you'll start to be able to recognize species by the furrowing in their bark and what that pattern looks like. The twigs will often change in color and hairiness as they age. And so this is something that you can see in this island oak. You can see that characteristic gold color in the young leaves. It will lose that. I think those are golden hairs, and they'll lose that, and you'll get this sort of drabbish color at the end. The Nuttall scrub oak is kind of known for these really thin, kind of reddish brown twigs and the overall architecture and branching pattern. So that's also very characteristic of this species and can be fairly reliable. So let's talk about the red oaks, the live red oaks. My cat does not want to talk about the red live oaks. So coast live, I talked about this a little bit already. Agrifolia, usually a tree. The bark is smooth in those kind of close-grown forest plants, but cracked to furrowed in the more open-grown woodland trees. The leaves are usually cupped. They're usually sparsely hairy, but not often shiny. And they'll hybridize with all the other oaks in the group. Santa Cruz Island oak, so this box means that this is a taxon of particular interest. This is a rare species. It's one of 2 rare varieties of Parvula. I used to work in Marin, and we had Parvula tamalpaisensis. This is found on the Channel Islands, called Santa Cruz Island oak. It's not limited to the islands, but it is kind of limited to the Southern California region where you are. The leaf margins are usually entire to shallowly toothed, so that's a little variable. They are truncated at the base, so you could see that flat edge here, and then tapered to the tip with kind of this noticeably yellow petiole of midvein. The Shreve oak, which is the other variety down your way, usually a tree. Some people do consider it to be a synonym of Wisslaseni, which is the interior live oak. The leaves are often larger than some of the other live oaks in the red oak group. They're variably spiny margined and really finely, well, not finely, but nicely teardrop shaped. And so you can see that overall shape and a little taper to the tip here. I've seen them be incredibly spiky to the point where they resemble that the canyon live oak photo that I showed earlier. And then interior live oak, Quercus wisslaseni, a lot like coast live oak, but the leaf should be shiny yellow-green on the underside. It's usually kind of elliptic shaped and flat, so it should be flatter than agrifolia. It should be rounder than parvula. And it does come in tree variety and shrub variety. So if we have time later, I'll tell you a little story about how I found out I didn't know anything about oaks after all. Blue oaks. This is a group that I put together. They're all white oaks. I think they all have a bluish cast to their leaves. They describe Tucker's oak as having a gray-green, but I'm going to call it blue-green, just for the purposes of this slide. So blue oak, very much a tree. I call it secretly deciduous because every time they lose their leaves, I'm like, oh, that's right, you're deciduous, because they look evergreen to me. They look like a live oak. The bark itself is strongly checkered and kind of really deeply furrowed. The leaves, usually 1 to 2 inches, they're blue-green and dull. They'll be round pointed and tapered to the base and really variable in their lobing. The lateral veining, which you can kind of see here, if you look, it's not that prominent. And it also has some hairiness on the lower surface, which is also not that prominent. The Tucker's oak, shrub to tree, it's evergreen. The young twigs are fuzzy and the older ones are pale, so you can see how pale that bark is on this older twig and how yellow that midvein is and the petiole. Leaves around 1 inch, they're kind of ovate. Sometimes they're entire, sometimes they're toothed, sometimes they're spine tipped. They will be hairy on the lower surface, which you can't quite see in this picture, but we'll have another picture of it later on. Alvord oak, which is one of our hybrids, and so if you think about it being a hybrid between this blue oak here and then the Tucker's oak, or maybe the Sonoran scrub oak, you can think about it being intermediate between those two. It's evergreen to deciduous, which is similar to both of its parents. Leaves 1 to 2 inches. They're ovate, irregularly toothed, but shouldn't be spine tipped. Blue to gray-green, and then hairy on the lower surface. And then you can see those lateral veins fairly well, not quite as well as you can see them in this Tucker oak. Engelmann oak, another one that is fairly clearly a tree and evergreen. The bark is also strongly furrowed. This is another rare species. It's occasionally used in plantings, and so it's becoming more common as a street tree. So it's important to understand if the tree that you're looking at was planted or if it's wild. Thinking about the leaves, they're 1 to 2 inches, kind of blue-green and dull. The margins are usually wavy dentate, which you can't see super well in this picture. But if you get up close to it, it will be pretty apparent. And then the lateral veining is indented, but not that prominent. So oaks with lobes. Valley oak, our largest, most common, and generally oldest native white oak, really losing ground to clearing. This is a species that is considered near threatened by the IUCN, and so we'd like to keep an eye on it and really note where these trees are right now, and particularly where they're recruiting or not. So the leaves, fairly large for our native oaks, 2 to 5 inches, lobed more than halfway to the base and dark green above and kind of pale fine hairy below. The bark is light gray, kind of thin furrowed, and it's a deciduous tree, and it's a main host for oak apple gall wasps. So if you see those California oak apple galls, they're the kind of reddish brown apple looking galls that are found primarily in valley oak. And so you can tell them, and also when they're hybridizing, those hybrids will sometimes have the galls. A secondary host or less common host is Quercus berberitifolia, which is also a white oak. But you can often tell these trees at a distance, even when they're younger, by the prevalence of those oak apple galls. McDonald oak, hybrid of valley oak, and the island scrub oak. This is endemic to the Channel Islands. It's a rare species that we're very interested in knowing about its reproduction. Kind of a low tree. It's a lot like valley oak. The leaves are smaller, the lobes are shallower, and they're also finely stellate hairy below, which reflects its other parent of the island scrub oak. Oregon white oak, Quercus garryana, 3 varieties of this: garryana, Samota, and berberitifolia. Really, garryana is kind of the only tree type. The other 2 are more shrubby. Not really common on the South Coast. I think Samota kind of is occasionally found in chaparral. Up in the north part of the state, it's hard to tell young garryana from young valley oak. But down in Southern California, the habitat is a pretty clear divider. So that's not that hard to do. Then California black oak, a member of our red oak group, really large leaves, tend to be kind of hand-sized, deep lobes, spine-tipped teeth, dark barked. It's deciduous, really easy to see when this hybridizes with the other evergreen, with the other oaks, because it's deciduous. So the offspring will be semi-deciduous, and the leaves will be smaller than most black oaks and larger than most of the live oaks, the red live oaks that it hybridizes with, and also lobed. Island oaks. So these are 4 species. They're all rare, either endemic to the Channel Islands or found mainly on the Channel Islands. The island scrub oak, Quercus pacifica, is a shrub to small tree. It's mostly evergreen, which probably indicates in the past it might have been of hybrid origin, but it's fairly stable now, even though it will hybridize with valley oak. The young twigs are reddish brown and they will age gray. These are about 1 to 1.5 inches, kind of obovate, dark above, and then that pale stellate hairy below. That's hard to say, but hairless in age. And in the margins, pretty variable in how toothed and lobed they are. McDonald oak, we already talked about. Quercus parvula, we already talked about. I'm going to skip those 2 and talk a little bit about the gold oak that we have here, which is the island oak, Quercus tomentella. It is an evergreen tree in that gold oak group. It's not limited to the Channel Islands because it's also found on the Guadalupe Islands. The leaves tend to be 2 to 3 inches. They're kind of ovate. The young leaves are this really beautifully golden, pale fuzzy. The older ones tend to be dull above and pale below. The hybrids with canyon live oak will be glossier and more irregularly toothed, which does recognize that other parentage. And then the lateral veins being indented, leading to those teeth at the leaf margins, really noticeable and kind of diagnostic in this oak. The spiky leaved oaks. These are all completely artificial groupings by me, by the way, because I like to group things, as you can maybe tell by now. Quercus berberitifolia, shrub to tree. It is evergreen. The leaves are smallish. They're really variable, but they should be shiny above and pale below with oppressed stellate hairs. There is some net veining that's often visible, and the leaf bases might appear slightly lopsided. This is kind of the most common oak of this type. Everything pretty much used to be called Demosa, and then there was some phylogenetic work that showed that that Demosa actually was this very narrowly prescribed oak that was coastal. So there was a split, and I think berberitifolia, Demosa, Cornelia smolleri, and maybe Turbinella and one other oak were split out. And so this is an instance where true Demosa is rare, but when you look at like the distribution in a spot like CalFlora or even in CCH, it's hard for understaffed herbaria to keep up with the synonymy. And so this is somewhere that actually INAT is really great, because they'll go through and make the shift and kind of track your oak through to the new naming. And so you can actually see how rare this oak actually is. So this is one, I talked about the thin red-brown twigs and the small leaves, shiny green above, and then the curly hairiness on the lower surface is important. The wavy margins also important. And then it should be, as I mentioned before, kind of within sight of the coast in Southern California. Cornelius mulleri, Muller's oak, should be a densely branched evergreen shrub. The twigs should be fuzzy. The leaves kind of to 1.5 inches, narrowly ovate, yellow, gray, green above, densely white fuzzy below, except for that yellow midrib. So thinking back to John Tucker's oak, kind of similar in the color, very different in how fuzzy it is below, and then tends to be further south and further inland than Demosa. Palmeri, we already talked about. So this is another shot of it, the evergreen shrub, the rigid spreading wing twigs. The rigid twigs is an important feature for this one, and then the densely glandular fuzzy. So glandularity, not something that you commonly see in oak leaves, but this one densely glandular fuzzy below, but aging pale and glabrous, as you can see in the twig. The margins wavy and spine-toothed, and this one is a really interesting distribution. It's fairly commonly distributed, but very sparse across California. So this is something that is considered, I think, near threatened by the IUCN. All right, talking more about golden oaks, I don't think that I've introduced you to canyon live oak, which is our most common evergreen tree, sometimes a shrub in this group. The leaves tend to be 2 to 3 inches, teardrop shaped and leathery. They're really dark, shiny above, and usually nicely golden below, but sometimes pale gray. The young twigs will be gold fuzzy and they'll age gray, and they will hybridize with others in this group. Shocking, I know. Island oak, I already talked about. Cedros island oak, I did not talk about. It's not actually in the area, but I wanted to fill out my golden oak card here. It is a rare oak that we are concerned about. It does go down into Baja in its distribution. Another shrub to small tree, and you can see the similarities between this and canyon live oak, but smaller leaves, duller leaves, not too sparsely toothed, and the margins are sometimes rolled over, which is something that you don't tend to see in the canyon live too much. And then I already talked about the Palmer oak as well. So trees with cupped leaves or shrubs. Coast live oak, I've talked a lot about, but you can see the cupped leaf is something that is usually pointed to tell it from Whistliseni pretty easily. And so if it's there, it's relatively diagnostic, but if it's not there, you need to dig a little deeper. Leather oak, Quercus dorata, variety dorata, beautiful oak on serpentine soils in the spring when there's new growth and it's kind of pinkish and the older leaves are blue and there's a little bit of white dusting on the leaves, and then the catkins are all golden. It's just beautiful. One of my favorite oaks. Don't tell the other oaks. So these leaves are cupped. The lateral veins are usually visibly indented. The margins can be really toothy and spine-tipped, or they can be relatively smooth, as you can see here in this photo. The San Gabriel variety, Dorata variety gabrielensis, usually found not on serpentine, but on granitics. It's otherwise very much like leather oak, except for the base of the leaf doesn't tend to be super tapered. It's a little more variable than the straight up leather oak, and tends to be densely short, hairy on the undersides when young, instead of just being fuzzy. Very limited in its distribution, and one of the rare species that we're interested in tracking. So usually found in the San Gabriels and a little bit on the southeast portion of the Western Transverse Range. And then I already talked about Tomentella, but that's another one, excuse me, that is usually has those cupped leaves. So kind of took you on a whirlwind through a lot of the oaks in your area. Here's kind of a table that talks about which ones are common or uncommon. The ones that are highlighted in blue are the oaks that are considered to be rare by somebody. And then there's a little bit about where they could be found. The one that I didn't talk about that's in gray is the Quercus ilex, which is a non-native and occasional. It's actually in its own group, in the ilex group of oaks. So densely hairy on the underside, and the acorns kind of button-like, the leaves kind of oblong. And I think if you look that up, you'll find it to be fairly distinctive. It's commonly planted, as is the cork oak, which has really distinctive bark. It looks like really thick, corky bark, which is where you get cork. But I think Quercus ilex is the only one that really does escape to the wildlands. I don't tend to see cork oak escape too much. So oaks are messy. Just to sum up, tracing parentage can be tricky. So kind of a soap opera, like whose child is this? So oaks will really readily hybridize with others in their group. You want to pay attention to the characteristics if they seem to be intermediate between species, and make notes of potential parental plants in the area. So if you have a blue oak that looks maybe a little too spiky edged, or if you have you know, an oak that looks a little more lobed than maybe it should be, taking a gander at the other oaks in the area is a really important thing to do. And then taking multiple photos. You can see down here in iNut, you could take and load multiple photos. So you can take a photo of the leaf underside and the twig and the bark and the overall habit. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So there are a lot of sources of variability. The age of the whole plant or the age of particular leaves or twigs can change the appearance of diagnostic characteristics. Herbivory and fire will often result in resprouting, and those resprouting leaves can look very different, even from young leaves of a plant that's just growing out new leaves for the year. And then the environment. So I talked a little bit about how drought can change the size and even the duration of the blue oak leaves, but plants that are growing, or leaves that are growing in sun versus shade, are going to be very different sizes as well, usually. And then hybridization will also change leaves and other aspects of trees and shrubs in the oaks. So taking multiple photos is going to help you and others to identify these plants. Acorns do tend to be stable and often diagnostic, but they're not always viewable. So I don't tend to see oaks when I am out doing, or I tend to see oaks, but I don't tend to see acorns a lot. Either they're too high up in the tree, or they're only visible at a particular time of year, maybe not when I am out looking at plants. And so I don't tend to rely on them. It's great when I have them and I can use them for identification, but the cues that I've given you here should be fairly usable when you're out and about. Something else that you can use to your advantage is that some taxa will grow in particular areas or particular habitats or soils, and they can either be ruled in or out. So definitely take notes about that aspect of it as well. So just to remind us about, starting with plant identification and oak identification, learning those common species and the breakpoints and the key, learning the features that you need to tell the common ones from the others, taking a note and or a photo of all of these different features, preferably with something for scale, being lazy but suspicious, so accepting that you may know a little bit and can start kind of further down in the key or skip right to the description, but making sure that you're checking back to what you actually saw in the field and that it's matching, that the things that are different from the description are within sort of the accepted variation that's described. gone this whole way and not really talked about OakWatch. So this is one of the ways that we want to improve our understanding of biodiversity is through the California OakWatch group. So this is a project in iNaturalist. These are some screenshots, and many thanks to Jose Esparza, who's our community science coordinator, for putting this together and putting these screenshots and sourcing all the photos from this presentation. This is a link to the presentation. It's California OakWatch on iNaturalist. This is the first journal entry, and it talks about all of the things that you will want to take pictures of or notes about in the project or in your particular observation. And it's also got a lot of links to other presentations about how to use iNaturalist, how to take good photos, how to add particular features to your record, all of those things that you might find helpful in getting started. I really wanted to focus this presentation on identification because that's not something that we have right now, particularly in iNaturalist, is something that's specific to the oaks in your area. So I wanted to provide you with that and then hook you up with the link to this project. And thank you, Richard, for joining the OakWatch project. That's awesome. So some of the things, and this hopefully reinforces the pieces that I've talked about in this presentation, is having the habitat shot showing the oak in context with some sort of an indication of height. So you can see here, nice big oak tree, little tiny people underneath, that gives you a sense of size. And then in number 6, you can see the baby oak and the foot for scale. So that's great. Close-up of twig, and the color is usually important in identification. Having kind of a macro level shot of the upper and underside of leaf to see those hairs and trichomes, preferably with scale. Usually you kind of understand how big a finger is, so that can be helpful. And then the other thing is having a hand in the photo is that a lot of camera phones are trained to focus in on skin tone and not necessarily on leaf tone. So having your hand in the photo will actually get the camera to focus in on what you want to focus in on. Although here you can see it's really focused in on the whorls of the hand and not so much on the snowy hairs on the leaf, but that's fine. Photo of the upper and underside of the leaf, so you can really see if there's kind of that inrolling of the margin. You can check out the hairiness and color of the upper and underside of the leaf. This also gets the twig in the shot. So we don't necessarily have to go like 1, 2, 3, 4. If you have one shot that gets you all of these things, that's great. And then you can add, we put a field on tree life stage. So you can select seedling, sapling, mature, resprout, or seed. And then what we're using, oaks are messy, so we're a little messy too. We're tracking regeneration, but we can't always be sure that, what's a seedling versus a sapling. So we're just going with it. If it's below the knee, we're considering a seedling. If it's knee to shoulder height, it's considered a sapling, and using that as a proxy for life stage. If it's a resprout, you should be able to see a trunk somewhere that it's resprouting from the base of. And so it should be fairly obvious if you have this kind of grouping of sprouts that are coming up pretty vigorously from a central point. There's usually a stump or the remains of the stump there. So this is actually a video that you can see on how to add that field to your observation. And so that's kind of it. I'm happy to take questions or comments about the oaks or go back through the presentation and talk about some specific things. If you want to join the project, you can either go to our CNPS page. There's a community science page and an OakWatch. You can go directly to iNaturalist. You can contact either me or Jose, either at our CNPS emails or on iNaturalist. I'm Boshniakia on iNat, and Jose is JASparsa11. And I am going to leave that up, I think, and stop with the laser pointer maybe. and take some questions.
I think, and Andrea, there was a question about what type of oak Susan could plant in Simi Valley.
Yeah, small tree, large shrub, 8 to 10 feet. I would highly recommend that you actually go to Calscape, which is calscape.org, and put in Quercus and your address, and it should tell you, or maybe just Simi Valley, because that tends to get you better results. And look through those. I would say Engelmannii, but I don't know how close Simi Valley is to wild populations. And so I'm always concerned about planting rare species near remnant populations of rare species. Kind of freaks me out a little bit. So I would say go to Calscape and look up some options there. Unless other folks in the audience have some suggestions, feel free to put them in the chat. So thank you, Susan, for thinking about planting a native oak. It's super important for supporting biodiversity. So Santa Monica Mountains have Quercus ex McDonaldii, and it's a hybrid of lobata and berberitifolia. See, this is the thing, like when they split Demosa, I think that may have messed up what we were calling McDonaldii's parents. So it might be lobata and berberitifolia. It might be lobata and Demosa. It might be lobata and it's the other one. It might be Cornelius Mulleri, the Sonoran scrub oak. I'm honestly not sure. So I think in Sheps, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen because then I can actually look it up. And
if I could clarify my question, yeah. I'm so sorry. It's in this really funky place in Chesborough, the southern extent of Quercus lobata. It's just 2 trees, and they're really funky. And like all the staff at MPS have looked at them, and yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Chesborough, but yeah.
Yeah, that's super exciting. Do you have those observations up anywhere? I mean, can I ask you to contact me?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with James Bailey on iNaturalist, but he's also identified them. So
okay. Yeah,
but I could contact you as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the great thing, and thanks for talking about that. So the iNaturalist project will automatically scrape all of the observations of native oaks into it, but unless you join and trust the project, we can't see the coordinates of the rare species and follow up with people on like, oh, this is somewhere where the rare species are reproducing. So it's super important to know. So that would be really interesting to delve a little further into, and kind of the point of why we're doing all of this. So thank you very much for that. Question about, so Quercus berberitifolia, fantastic in Simi Valley. Thank you, Richard. Is there a risk of someone planting the wrong oak, and are they exasperating or compounding the parent/hybrid issue? So it's really only a potential problem, I think, when you're talking about rare species. So a lot of these oaks are in such numbers that a little bit of pollen from a street tree or a tree that's planted in somebody's yard is not going to go far enough to really affect wild populations. But when you're talking about either connecting rare populations with a bunch of street trees, that's something that actually happened with the Monterey pines, is they were so commonly planted, particularly along the freeways, that it connected all of the rare populations. Disease was allowed to move through. It connected them with all of the pathogens and allowed those to move as well. So that's a real issue. And so I'm really concerned about it, mostly with just the rare plants and not so much the more common species. And then sourcing your plants is also an important thing. So we have another project called Project Reoak, where we're trying to connect people who want to plant oaks with locally sourced oaks And so we also have a page for that on our CNPS website, and you can look up some information about that. And that's something that we're hoping to get going again this fall. So question about providing oaks with supplemental water or irrigation during the summer. It's not something that I am a big fan of because it has a huge prospect of going poorly. So to the extent that disease is not likely, if you are seeing your tree looking drought stressed and you can water it at a time when it's not going to be hot, because even if there isn't disease present, if you're watering during a hot day, that can actually raise the temperature of the soil to the extent that you are hurting the tree. So that's kind of my concern with supplemental water or irrigation during the summer. So if you can do it at a time when it's not going to be hot, before the water has a chance to kind of move through the system, then I'm not super concerned about that. So indications of heat stress, there'll be some leaf drop, which is normal. Like I think for well-established oaks, it's not that much of an issue. It's if you're trying to keep your oak alive during the establishment phase that it's pretty important. And I am going to stop answering this question because we're getting like way out of what my expertise is. I'm even a little uncomfortable talking about like Southern California oaks because I've been a Northern California oak person for so long. So growing plants, I am not great at. I am excellent at killing plants. So spend a lot of time killing non-native plants and even some native plants. So Douglas fir, looking at you. So I'm not great with kind of the gardening questions, and I will defer to some of the resources that we have on our gardening page of the CNPS website, and hope that you find your answers there. And feel free to follow up with kind of gardening@cnps.org. Yeah, and so I will definitely have this slide deck posted, and then there will be the recording also posted, I think, on the CNPS YouTube page. And so I'm hoping that either Ellen or Pat will follow up and let you know when that's posted, but we'll definitely have it up.
So Andrea, where are you going to post the slide deck? Is that on this web page at the CNPS website?
Yeah, it might take a little bit. We're gonna post the slide deck on our OakWatch page. Right now, that's just a link to the INAT project, but we'll find a spot for it and get it up there for people to download kind of in PDF form so they have it to refer to. I'm hoping to expand this and make some tables so that you can just kind of look through like, okay, for twigs, and then you've got like all of the species, and then for, so kind of a table of characteristics. So, but I do like that, that this presentation has some photos, because photos are always helpful to refer to.
Okay, are there any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And Andrea, thank you so much for a great talk and spending this time with us. We really appreciate it. And like I said, our website has information on our chapter's activities, and we also have contact information there. So let us know if you want to join the chapter for another activity. All right.
Thanks so much for having me. I think Andrea has a question.
Yeah. Okay, so I live in a coastal live oak woodland, and so I assume you don't want to have data on all the little oak trees springing up everywhere. You just want it on the rare oaks?
We're really focused on the rare oaks. I think coast live oak is a plant that is doing well in recruiting. It is under a lot of stress from pests and pathogens in various parts of the state. So it's fairly easy for us to kind of parse through the data and get out what we want. But at the same time, like if you can spend your time on the rare oaks, that's probably more helpful to everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So it also looks like Richard maybe has another question.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Based on Dr. Sork's research at UCLA, the Quercus lobata in Santa Monica Mountains seem to be unique from Quercus lobata in other parts of the state. Has there been talk about making those their own variety, since they're likely a different population that's not mixing with Northern California lobata or Central Valley lobata?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if there's been talk about making them their own variety. This is something that I leave the taxonomists to do. It's already so hard for people to draw lines in oak populations. And so that's something that I just kind of pay attention to when it happens and don't have a lot of opinions on. I am a big advocate of making sure that peripheral populations are protected and honored as being peripheral and special in their own right. And so the whole like moving and mixing species around and connecting populations that weren't connected is something that I try to advise against. But I think that's as far as I get in the taxonomy piece of things.
So Andrea, did I get the link right to OakWatch? Somebody asked me to post it, and I did the
Yes.
one from iNaturalist. Does that look right?
Yeah, thank you for posting that. So that's the journal entry. You can get back to the project from there. The journal entry will tell you about the project and about how to take data for the project as well.
Okay, any more questions? All right, sorry, Andrea, that I cut you off earlier. I didn't see your hand. Okay, all right, so thank you again, everybody, and thank you, Andrea.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
You too.